Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing The Tragedy of Macbeth. This film was directed by Joel Coen. Coen, of course, one half of the Coen brothers, the legendary writer-director duo. But his solo effort here, he's going for what I consider an unexpected departure, very serious, going full on Shakespeare, literally. And I guess I just didn't see it coming, but he is tackling one of my favorite plays in all of Shakespeare. So I was very intrigued, and it seems to me, just in terms of the look of it, especially when I initially saw the trailer, he seemed to be stripping back a lot of the context of the era in which it was written, and it's going a lot more for the modern, very clean look that is black and white, very gothic, expressionistic. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Fritz Lang, Carl Dreyer, those kinds of influences, I'd say. It's also very angular, and it's very much built on like the architectural structure that seems to be navigating more the cerebrum here. And it reminds me very much of like Christopher Nolan in a lot of ways. Just, you know, again, the architecture and the blocking are very important to the metaphorical binding of just the whole idea and the story. And going for that more sterile style, I think it's naturally going to be a little bit more skeletal. And like I said, going more for the cerebral, more the psychological, and how that can be interpreted visually. And I guess it did succeed in that in terms of what it's going for, because this does feel much more like a cerebral deconstruction and much less of an emotional type of experience for me. And the characters are stripped kind of down to their most basic core functions, I think, the basic necessities of what their characters serve in the story. And it's, you know, more like chess pieces. And aesthetically, you know, I think they really, you know, thought it through to at least a degree. I mean, the shots are really, really beautiful, some of them. And, you know, it's a really nice use of stark contrast, I would say. And it's very true to its sources, you know, in terms of influences. It's clear that Joel Coen has a lot of taste because he really captures that expressionistic look, as well as bringing out a lot of textures in the face, you know, in the way like the close-ups are very powerful in like a Bergman film or a Dreyer film, as I always say. And also it reminded me of Orson Welles and a lot of his Shakespearean interpretations, Macbeth and Othello, as my main examples. I really like the witches here and the way that they're handled, because it really plunges you into the surreal in a way that is very confident, I think. And I like the way the tone abruptly changes anytime they are on screen. It's properly creepy and intriguing. And a great performance by Catherine Hunter, where she's really able to utilize kind of the theatricality, you know, like the artifice of performance, as well as making it seem very unsettling and very real. But unfortunately, overall, just the mood and the aesthetic of everything, atmospheric as it is, it did leave me feeling very cold. And like I said, I think I get what they're going for. They're going more for the modern experimental stripped down approach, so that you can kind of forget the context and the noise surrounding the period in which it took place and make it more kind of timeless. By making it more sterile and more clean, it's almost as if the words and the character dynamics can be brought to the forefront. I like the idea of a more modern clinical approach, kind of enhancing a lot of the dialogue and a lot of those character dynamics, because it's like this interesting contrast between something that is simple and something more multifaceted. But the problem is that the dialogue really isn't a catalyst for any sort of drama or complexity, because unfortunately, they tried to make it more accessible, and I think in a way it fell flat because of it. By having the actor speak it in more naturalistic ways, I do think that can work when handled appropriately. But here, it almost felt like they were afraid of that, and they were just really wanting to go for an accessible quality. And by doing that, I think you drain all of the poetry and the rhythm from the words, and it just drowns everything out in a sort of monotony. And the aesthetic, by choice, you know, is also very skeletal and too abstract as well. So, you know, I'm always kept at a distance. I'm just too removed from everything. Sometimes I think the more deconstructive, more stripped down approach, even though it thinks that it's being more bold by doing so, I think at times it can feel a little bit lazy. Again, only when it's not done well. When it's done well, it can be incredible. But it almost feels like you're hiding behind the abstractions. And by doing so, you kind of get lost in them. And it almost feels as if, you know, like we're hiding behind these highly praised aesthetics from the past because we know that they work. There's a fear of letting the language just speak for itself. And I think that kind of misses the point of what Shakespeare's about. I want the intimacy of these characters to be highlighted by all this stark contrast and everything, not so much buried by it. And yeah, I just think in today's world, I think we have like a strong resistance to a lot of that fantasy, a lot of that poetry from the great works of the past. Shakespeare as a great example. And we always want to go more for like the gritty realism. And again, I like realism to a degree, but I think when we do too much of it, it becomes one note. It almost limits the ambition of the piece, especially when it is Shakespeare. As an example, I find Lady Macbeth to be just utterly compelling. I think she's the most fascinating thing about the entire play, and there are a lot of things that are fascinating about it naturally. So I was excited to see how they would handle her. And of course, having Frances McDormand play her, I thought, that'll be really interesting. There's just a fascinating relationship between her and her husband, and it's kind of the core of everything. I think without the power of that, everything else ultimately is going to fall flat. And that's the problem. The film doesn't allow for any tension to build or any relationship at all to really build where we care about them. And again, I don't think it's the fault of the actors. I think they just weren't given a proper vehicle to be showcased. Lady Macbeth is just so volatile and so complicated, and it feels like you can do so many things with that character in order to allow her to really shine. I think about like the opening, like when you first meet her character and she gives that speech, where she says, "Unsex me." I love that speech. And, there's a million different actresses who have performed it in a variety of different ways, and seeing all the different ways you can interpret it is fascinating. It says a lot about her character and just the complicated nature of this woman feeling like her gender has compartmentalized her and it limits her power. But here it just felt uninspired and very quick, as though we were going through the motions, and there's never a scene here where we really get to settle in the environment and the feeling of it. It felt very much like we were fast forwarding through Macbeth for me. The tomorrow speech is another one that's very important, but of course that takes place at the end of the story, and it's a moment after a huge dramatic thing has happened, but yet you don't feel any sort of climactic build to it, and you don't feel that bleakness and that sense of reflection in the words. His wife just died, the walls are closing in on him, and this is just, a very important point in the story, and it's a very important point where you should take advantage of that from a dramatic standpoint. Typically with Macbeth, when they say the queen is dead, I feel a lot, and here I was shocked by how much I was like, okay, I barely knew her. How am I supposed to care? It feels like every line in Shakespeare, there are like multiple ways you can interpret it. You could break apart each phrase and analyze each one. And yet it feels like all the biting wit and the power of Shakespeare has just been drained under the pretense of accessibility. And there's just no life breathed into it for me. And I think if you're going to tackle a play like this, a story like this, there should be a sense of life. So ultimately, it just kind of failed to leave an emotional impact on me. This didn't feel like Macbeth or like an interpretation of Macbeth. It felt more like an interpretation of the Spark Notes of Macbeth, if that makes sense. And what's interesting is, I've been saying the one thing that is good about the film is like the cinematography. The look is really beautiful, yet no tension or emotional texture in it ironically makes the film feel very small. It makes it feel very uncinematic. But it's comfortable settling more into that aesthetic, really more than understanding what makes that aesthetic interesting. I don't think that it's a bad movie. I'm really shitting on it, I know, but I just think it's not very memorable, especially for somebody like Joel Coen, who you'd expect a lot from, especially a more unique point of view on the material, and especially if it's going to be Shakespeare. So yeah, just disappointing. I think, if you really love black and white cinematography and you like movies that have that look that are newer, certainly check it out for that. But beyond that, I don't see a huge reason to. But that is my review. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm going to plug my website as always. It is deepfocuslens.com. I am an artist and I do commission portraits and I sell prints of my work. If that's something that you're interested in, you can always go to the website below. And if you have a question about a commission or a portrait, you can always email me. My email is in the description box below as well. Also, I want to give a shout out to my patrons who have been wonderful. Thank you so much for your support. If you are interested in becoming a patron, the link for that is below, as well as the rest of my social media information. You can watch more videos here and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.